Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review is brought to you in part by Rogers Hobby Center in Saginaw, Michigan, where the fun begins. This review covers the Honda RA272, the 65 Mexico GP winner. Now, it's a 120 scale kit from Tamiya, number 20043. Now, Honda started the GP circuit in '64 with the 271 version, and it was somewhat disappointing. But learning from their experience, Honda steadily improved the racer, and with the RA272 version, they took the Grand Prix circuit by surprise in 1965, doing pretty well and finally winning the Grand Prix race in Mexico. Now, the kit features moldings in white, silver, black, and clear, with about 90 pieces. It also has water slide decals and branded Tampa printed tires. Now, it also has a complete V12 engine, and the detailed dash is really a standout. Oh, hey, that's Newt tapping on the divider there. He's our program director. Yeah, Newt, come on in here. You got a question?
Why are the wheels open like those really old cars from the early years?
I guess I'm not really sure, but I would guess that the designers felt that the extra weight of the fenders was not as efficient as just leaving the wheels open, and they hadn't really started putting aerodynamic designs with air dams in front of the wheels and things at that point yet.
Did this car win any other races?
Well, it not that I know of, but it did score in the top 10 in a couple of other races prior to its win in the Mexican GP. Here are the contents of the kit. As you can see, they're nicely arranged, and the sprue attachment points are kept to a minimum, along with parting lines. Now, we'll be using Model Master type liquid cement, sometimes a clear cement for the window type pieces, and even some super glue for strength for fragile parts. Here are the decals for the kit. The register is very good, and the carrier is very minimal. They're a nicely done decal set. Construction starts with the engine, and as you can see, it's fairly straightforward, but it is an oddball, a transverse mounted 12-cylinder engine. So go ahead and grab these parts and smooth out all the seams and edges before applying paint. Now, I used Tamiya XF16 for the aluminum and Testors 1131 for the gold tones. Again, as with the Lotus, I prefer the look of the Testors brass over the mixed version in the instructions. We'll continue working with the engine and some of the accessory pieces here, so grab the parts out of the kit and then clean those up, and we'll work with the intakes and carbs and some supports. A note here: when you separate the engine supports from the sprue trees, be careful because they're very delicate and you don't want to break them. And you'd want to use like a pair of side cutters or jewelry cutters. So I assembled the supports with the tank first, and then I put that aside to dry. And next, I assembled the supports that go onto the sides of the engine. And I decided I wouldn't paint the black parts, as they're a really nice semi-gloss without paint. So it's really not needed. Now, once the parts are assembled, set them aside to dry. Painting the carbs wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. The instructions say to use a flat aluminum for the carbs only, and some Testors brass for the intake manifold. Now, paint the manifold first and set it aside to dry, and then I look for a brush with a flat tip, not a pointed one, and that'll help painting the carbs without getting paint on the aluminum. Continue to work on the engine now, and we're going to add the starter, rear axles, and a couple of cooling pipes. And as I mentioned, be careful with those supports because they're very delicate. They could break. First, you can add the starter to the motor on the bottom of it, and then I didn't paint that again, as I like the color of the unpainted semi-gloss. And as they say, if it looks nice, well, don't fix it. Next we'll add the smaller of the two cooling pipes to the top of the engine. And it's okay to use a pair of tweezers as it's kind of hard to get in there with your fingers. Now also as a reminder, don't forget to scrape any of the paint away so that the glue adheres properly. Also, I deviated from the instructions and elected to glue that larger cooling pipe and the axles in later steps for proper alignment. And now we'll work with the exhaust, and it's not difficult compared to some for an assembly step. So clean those pieces up, and they're a bit different for the Honda, as half the cylinder exhausts come from the top and the other half come from underneath. So follow the instructions that you saw there and assemble the top exhaust. They go together without any position problems because the assembly pins and sockets are pretty secure, and the same for the bottom actually. So put those together and let them dry. But we'll be putting the exhaust into place on the engine, and that's another matter entirely. I used liquid cement on this pretty much after using tweezers to put the lower pipes together. You have to weave them around the engine supports and then put them in place, and then I added a liquid cement at that point to glue them to the block. Now after all three are in place, make sure the pins on the other end of the pipes are inserted in the hole in the engine supports, and use the same procedure to attach the lower set of pipes. Now for further definition, keep those tweezers out. Now when you put those upper set of pipes in, angle them up so they can be inserted into the holes on the top of the engine before you use any glue. Make sure you can position them to get all 5 pipes inserted firmly into the engine. And once they're there, use a toothpick or a small drop of glue tied to the end of each pipe to make sure that it then is glued into position in the engine in the proper socket there. And if you do that and all the pipes are square, then all the supports will be just fine. And next we'll add some pieces to the engine to start wrapping that up. And you're going to get the cylinder heads and the mounting plate and the fuel distribution system distributor here out. Now we're going to paint the fuel pump, that round portion there, a flat gunmetal. And then the bottom plate, of course, is aluminum colored. And the lower section of the carb there, or fuel pump, I should say, distribution manifold, that's kind of a brownish red. And so we're going to also then use a little Molotov chrome pen to lightly touch the bolt heads all over the engine there, where you could see them, to add a little pizzazz to that engine. Now they assemble nicely, they go together only one way, so put those in place after they've dried. Next we can start working on the suspension parts, and after the challenge of painting that fuel distributor and the other section, this will be pretty easy. So now when you're putting them together, don't forget to insert the bushings before gluing the suspension parts, and they hold the wheels in place and allow them to turn, but don't get any glue on that bushing. So the call outs here are pretty straightforward from the instructions, so go ahead and paint them up as called out there and get those ready to assemble later. And now we can get these pieces out for the undercarriage and the front suspension, and there's going to be quite a bit of freehand painting here. The entire undercarriage of the body has parts that are molded in, and like the hoses, pipes, radiator cap, and a couple other pieces. So just pick those out as the instructions indicate. And most of the colors I agreed with, except for the metallic gray and radiator tank. Here I used an old metallic gunmetal paint. So the only other thing was that the radiator cap, instead of just using some chrome silver, I touched that with the liquid chrome pen, and it came out very nice. Finally, just follow the front suspension instruction sequence and use some super glue here to keep those small pieces in place. Also remember to paint, all the paint has to come off where you glue pieces together for good adhesion. And next up, we'll be working with the seat, the radiator, and the pedals. And so get those pieces out from the kit. And we're going to paint the upper pad on the back of the seat a dark gray, as the recommendations are, and also the lower pad of the seat there, the portion is a light gray. And you may find, especially nowadays with this pandemic, that it's hard to get the paint that you want. So, don't be afraid to just mix it up with the colors that you have on hand. So, after I masked off the areas and applied the colors, and then I let them dry. And once they were dry, you can glue them to the seat, the floor of the undercarriage there. Now, the upper part of the pedal block is racing white. So the pedals themselves are a flat aluminum. So I would recommend you spray the white and let it dry, and then hand brush the pedals themselves. Now, when the pedals are dry, you can glue them to the floor assembly, and remember to scrape the glue before you glue those in place. Now, as for the radiator, we're going to glue the two halves of the radiator together before we paint them. And then its color is a little bit different. I think it's like an antique brass. So Tamiya has you mixing some gold with a little bit of brown, and that seems to be the brass color that mostly appears in the pictures I've seen. So once that's done, glue it to the front suspension, being careful to get all the 4 points inserted into the radiator for the mount. Now at step 10, we'll be dealing with the side walls and the rear firewall roll bar and one of the linkages there. And we're going to paint the interior side walls a semi-gloss black, and let that dry. And then the roll bar and the rear wall should be painted with some of that racing white as the body color. And after it had dried and cured, you can brush the remainder of the components that are molded into the rear wall according to the instruction sequence and pickouts. Now, I used a 2mm pen, chrome pen, to stay inside the line, so to speak, here on the larger pipe. And then just above the larger pipe, there's two smaller ones, and there I used a 1mm pin to highlight those. Now, before gluing the sidewalls to the floor, paint the shifter and the linkage there as the instructions indicate. And also make sure you scrape any paint off before you glue them. Now, glue the sidewalls to the floor, and you need to follow their instruction sequence just exactly. And after that, glue the small fluid containers to the rear wall, and then the rear wall to the side walls and the floor. Okay, and next we're going to work with the instrument panel and the steering wheel there, and some of the cockpit stuff. So Tamiya suggests you paint the rings around the instruments. So I used a Molotow 1mm pen for that, but the decals actually have rings around them already if you're not comfortable with that detail. So anyway, when the paint's dry on the rings or the then you can add the decals according to the instructions, and they're all numbered there so you know where they go. And when that's done, glue the instrument panel into place. Finally, we're going to put the steering wheel on, and the molded in color is a good semi-gloss black. We're going to leave it that way. And I used the 2mm pen on the steering wheel spokes to brighten that up into the chrome aluminum type of coloration. So don't forget to paint the back of the spokes as well. And as with the other parts, when the paint's dry there, glue the wheel to the instrument panel. Next, we'll be gluing the body to the chassis and the engine with its supports to the end of the chassis there. So the first thing you do is glue the body to the chassis, and then review the instructions carefully to know where to insert the front of the body over that suspension piece and then into the chassis. And be careful when you spread the rear part of the body apart that you don't break it. Now make sure the body's evenly attached on both sides. I had a bit of trouble on the one side having a gap. I found that it was a simple misalignment the way the parts go together, so dry fit those so you know how they go together before you glue them. And now don't forget to glue the front suspension to the body that you've installed there, and make sure you scrape the paint off before you glue it. Now next, we're going to test fit all 6 of the engine and support attachment points that are inserted into the body. And after you've gotten a good idea of how they fit, you glue them to the rear of the body there. And you'll need 3 hands to hold one side while inserting the other and holding onto the body. Once again, make sure you practice before you use the glue. So in steps 14 and 15, we're going to first get the rear lower arms, and then these steps begin to finish that rear suspension by attaching them to the rear uprights and the brakes. Now the rear lower arms are molded in that semi-gloss black, so I've left that because it looks good. And so go ahead and attach those to the lower suspension as instructions show you there. And then next we're going to paint the disc brakes, and I started with a metallic gray for the discs, and they look pretty good on the rotors. And after that's dry, you can paint the calipers with semi-gloss black. Finally, get some of that brass coloring that you mixed up earlier and paint the top of the caliper. Once that's dry, attach the brakes to the rear supports. And don't forget the poly cap in there when attaching the brakes, so that holds the rear wheels on and allows them to turn. On to the final rear suspension assembly now. And now for step 16, we're going to be inserting the suspension by attaching the shocks in the small tank and the rear brakes and upper arms. And we're going to begin by gluing the small tanks to the rear suspension supports, according to the location indicated in the instructions there. And it's hard to see because it's black on black, but if you look close, they're right next to the shock absorber. And by the way, I didn't use any paint on the small tank as it looks good as is. Next, we're going to paint the shock absorber according to the instructions. And I used Molotow chrome pen on the shock's collar flanges. Other than that, I just used the paints they recommend. So when they're dry, carefully glue the shock to the suspension. And I tried to use some tweezers, but I found that I could actually put it into place with my fingers better. And now, remember back at step 3, we held off on the rear drive shafts because there was too much play. Well, we're gonna fix that now, and we're gonna begin by gluing the shaft to the back of the brake assembly, and this will hold it in place with minimum movement until the assembly is attached to the suspension. Now glue the brake assembly, including the axle shaft to the rear suspension, making sure that the axle shaft goes into the hole in the transmission, and then repeat this for the other side. In step 17, we're going to use some clear part cement or white glue to glue the windshield to the body, and gluing it first makes it easier to attach the mirrors later. Now we're going to be painting the mirrors according to the instructions, and the stem is the same color as the body, while the head is a metallic gray. And grab your Molotow chrome pen and cover the mirror portion, and then after it's dry, glue the mirrors into place. Scrape away any paint for attachment points, and make sure that the mirrors are straight up and down like it shows in the instructions. So grab the wheels and tires out of the kit, and the tires are fine. They're treaded, so you can scuff up that tread area a little bit for realism, but they're just beautiful with the Goodyear Gold Leaf logo. Now the wheels are semi-gloss black and of course molded in that color, so I left them that way. I used the chrome pen there for the outside of the rim where the bead goes on the outside of the tire, and Tamiya says they're X11 silver, but that's up to you. To me, the Molotow does a fine job in this area, and it's nice and clean too. So once the rims are dry, you can push them into the tires, and make sure that you use the wider rims on the rear tires because they're a little wider than the fronts. And once they're assembled, you're ready to install the tires and wheels onto the car. And be careful when putting them into place because the suspension is very fragile. So push each wheel onto the appropriate brake, and make sure that you put a little back pressure behind where you're pushing to keep that suspension from breaking. And there are some small snap rings inside the brakes that will grab the wheel and hold it into place. So we're on to step 20 and then the decaling. And this step's pretty simple. These rear cowls need to be painted body color, and you can, if you're going to leave them attached to the vehicle, just paint them inside and outside. I did not because I'm going to be removing the parts so that you can see the engine, etc. So after that's dried, you attach the side rear cowlings, and it was pretty interesting because you kind of weave those parts in between the suspension pieces there. And don't over tighten the screws that are used to attach it to the frame because you don't want to strip the plastic for those. Now the decals for the kit were very nice, but they were also very thin and fragile. One thing that you can do is don't give them any more time than necessary to remove them from the backing paper so that they're still just a little bit more thick, so to speak, and won't roll over on you as easily. Also, that large circle piece, that comes in 4 parts because it's attached to different segments and sections on the front cowl there. That needs to be handled carefully. And as they're drying, you may need to put some setting solution on top and then keep making sure that those don't curl up on you as they dry. Other than that, they should go on pretty well, but just pay heed to the fact that you have to give them a little bit extra attention. Well, there you have it. This gorgeous little racer goes together very nicely, and with some patience and a lot of detailing, you can come up with a superb looking model for your shelf. Now, it didn't have any real construction problems, but there are fragile pieces, so you'll need to be very careful. I would not recommend this for a newbie. This is going to take some experience to do properly. But nonetheless, as you can see, it's a real gorgeous shelf sitter, and if I were you, I'd buy one and put it on my shelf. Well, we hope you liked this step-by-step premium quality model kit review. So that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do that by clicking on the icon in the lower right hand of any of the reviews. Or you can find us on Facebook or our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks!